The first thing I should say about this talk is that it bears some resemblance to the abstract that I wrote, but the abstract I realized was quite ambitious, and I'm not going to have time to talk about everything in the abstract. In particular, I'm not going to talk much about the aesthetic implications of the issues about olfaction that I'm going to discuss. But we can talk about this in the discussion if anybody wants to. So maybe at certain points in the talk I'll just raise these issues. Part of the reason for this is because I have written on this elsewhere, and I wanted to present something a bit different and a bit new, although I realize that most of you, if not all of you in the room, won't be familiar with what I've said elsewhere. What I'm going to talk about is the difference between olfactory experience and visual experience, which according to some philosophers who have written about this, reflects quite badly on the informational capacities of olfaction, in particular to represent objects in the world. So in some sense, the aim of this paper is to defend olfactory experience from some of the criticisms that philosophers have made, and to show that it can, at least in some contexts and for some objects, do a pretty good job of representing them. And it does resemble, in some ways, I think, some of the richness that the spatial individuation of objects in visual experience, that there is in visual experience. So I'm going to, as I go through the talk, I'm going to start by raising and looking at some of the views that people have put forward about olfaction, and then I'm going to basically criticize these views. I'm going to focus on wine as an object of olfactory experience, primarily because I think that wine is a nice example, and maybe it's one of the very few examples of an olfactory object, what I'm going to call an essentially olfactory object, that is a structured object in olfactory experience, structured in ways that get around some of the criticisms that philosophers have leveled at olfaction in comparison to visual experience. Okay. So about halfway through the talk, I'll give you a bit of a clearer rundown of my aims and how the argument's going to work. But let's just start off with some of the main views in the area. Okay. So a lot of philosophers have pointed out that in vision, we're presented with a world of objects that have a spatial structure, okay, in respect of themselves and in respect of the environment in which they're located. Okay, so vision presents us with individual objects that are bounded. Actually, I'm not sure the whole slide is being shown, but anyway, let's go on. So vision presents us with individual objects that are bounded, separate from one another in space and arranged.
We have to fix that.
Yeah, we have to fix that.
You have the wrong number of pixels on the screen.
Yeah, so the size of the size. Okay, so let's go quite quickly through this stuff. So the main point here is that visual experience represents objects which have a spatial structure and that are individuated from each other and from the background environment in which they are. So this allows us to distinguish and individuate particular objects. So when I look at the water bottle, I can see its location in the environment as well as its relative position to other objects around it. And I can see that it changes its aspects when I move around it, right? So there's a three-dimensional orientation with respect to me when I look at it. Okay. So these are kinds of parts of the visual experience which philosophers have thought of as involving complex spatial structure that allows us to individuate and distinguish, identify particular objects in vision. Okay, and just quickly through this. So one of these aspects that vision gives us is what people refer to as property binding, which is a prerequisite for individuating particular objects. Again, so we don't just see an undifferentiated mass of properties, of colors and shapes, but they're bound together into specific locations as properties of objects. And so in this way as well, vision has features that philosophers have referred to as an attributional phenomenology. So when I see the blue chair, it seems to me that the blueness is a property of the chair that's given to me, as it were, in the phenomenology of my visual experience. It seems to be a property that is of the object rather than of my experience. And this is closely related to the issue of transparency. So the idea is that when I attend, as it were, when I look inwards at my visual experience, this is, of course, all of this is controversial to some degree. Okay? So some people, of course, deny the transparency of experience, but a lot of people think that visual experience is at least transparent in some sense. That is, when I try to attend to features of my inner experience, all I can do is really attend to the objects of those experiences. So if I try to describe the characteristics of my experience, really all I can do is describe the features of the objects of that experience. So these are controversial, but they're features that philosophers have pointed to in order to contrast vision with olfaction. And one aspect of this I was particularly interested in, but don't really have as much time as I would like to discuss it. And actually, nor did I have the time to come up with as convincing an argument as I would like to have. Is that occlusion is a fundamental feature of visual experience because of all these features that I've mentioned, and it's the kind of thing that people deny of olfactory experience. I'll come to olfactory experience in a second. So the idea is that visual experience is presented with objects that are mereologically complex. They have parts, they're spatially complicated things. And this ability to situate 3D objects within this kind of visual space, as it were, allows objects to be occluded. So we see them as having hidden profiles and hidden aspects. We see one object in front of another. Okay, so this seems to be a fundamental feature of visual experience. And what I would like to do is show that there's an analog in olfaction. And that goes some way to showing that olfactory experience is richer than visual experience. That's what I would like to show, but I don't think I'll show it very convincingly in this talk. But we can talk about it in the discussion. So all of these things make up what philosophers refer to as the representational content of experience, the representational content of visual experience. Okay, so when I see a red tomato, we're presented with the appearance of a round object in the world independently of me. And the structure of such an experience is predicative, right? It has properties, X is red and X is round. The property red appears to belong to the object and as such is predicated of it. That's the attributionality of the experience. So I'm going through this quite quickly because I assume that at least the philosophers in the room are very familiar with this stuff. Okay, so in sum, visual experience we can say is representational in nature, which essentially just means it's related to the world. It presents the world to us in a certain way. It has content that can be true or false of the world. And this representational content is spatially structured. It allows for the particularity and individuation of objects within the experience. The experience is transparent, attributional, allows for the occlusion of its objects. In other words, you could say simply its objects are solid. Okay, and this allows visual experience to play a kind of cognitive role in giving us knowledge about the world because it's representational. And the contrast with olfaction is just going to be that some people have claimed that when we smell, the smell is not related to the world. It has no representational content. The smell is just a property of my experience. Okay, that's going to be the idea. So here are just some quotes in the literature, which I'll just read through quickly to give you some sense of what philosophers have said about this. Christopher Peacock says, a sensation of smell may have no representational content of any sort, though of course the sensation will be of a distinctive kind. So it feels like something to have a sensation, and we can distinguish sensations from each other, but the sensation itself doesn't present you with anything, any information about the world as such. It doesn't present the world to you in a way. It has no representational content. David Chalmers says smell has little in the way of apparent structure and often floats free of any apparent object. So this is an important point I'll come back to. The idea is that smells can linger in a sort of indeterminate way in front of you. We don't attribute them directly, so the thought goes, to properties to objects in olfaction. So when I see the blueness of the cushion, my visual experience, remember, presents the blueness as a part of the cushion, right? It's located on the cushion. We see it as belonging to the cushion. And the idea is that olfaction doesn't do that. When we smell odors, when we have smells, if they're located anywhere, they're in us, right? In our noses or our brains. Okay, we don't attach them directly to objects. That's the idea. Yeah, so as Lycan says, smell seems to be a modification of our own consciousness rather than a stable property of a perceptual object that would exist unperceived. Whereas vision offers a multitude of different perspectives that are to some extent under the subject's control. We cannot easily see how one could entirely by smell check and recheck an external object's identity or character by gaining successively different olfactory perspectives on that object. So again, smell doesn't really latch onto the world. Okay, it doesn't represent any object. It's not intentional. And to show that it's not just vision that has these properties and olfaction lacks them, hearing too, Lycan says, comes to us as spatially organized in some sense, even phenomenally speaking, whereas smell is aspatial, right? So we hear sounds as coming from a certain direction, as having some sort of location, whereas smell is just in us. Okay, that's the idea. And final quote from Claire Batty. So Claire Batty has written a series of recent papers on smell, probably more than anyone else that I can think of. So she says the properties presented in olfactory experience seem disengaged from any particular object, right? Smells can linger undetached from their objects. And as such, the content of smelling does not seem to be predicative as the content of vision is, nor does the possibility of there being an olfactory illusion seem to make much sense, right? In olfactory experience, we can never merely on the basis of this experience distinguish the place in the scene before my nose at which the property is instantiated from the place at which it is not. Okay, so these are all the kinds of claims I'm going to take issue with. But here's the upshot for olfaction, just as a summary of the kinds of points philosophers have made. So smells, it's thought, an olfactory experience, lack spatial structure. Smells are diffused and vaguely located somewhere around you or even in your nose or in your brain, if you want to think of it like that. And they don't give the relative positions of objects nor represent their direction as, say, sounds do. There's no property binding, right? The smell of cheese can linger without its source objects. You walk into a room, you smell the fondue, but maybe the fondue was removed 20 minutes ago. There's no more fondue in the room. The smell lingers. And this, therefore, doesn't allow olfactory experience to individuate objects, right? So it can't by itself locate determinate properties, doesn't achieve the property binding necessary for us to identify and discriminate the objects to which odors belong. Right, so the epistemological implications are that olfaction is essentially a sensational experience, right, rather than representational. So it's not about the world, it's about us. All we learn when we smell is about a property of our experience. We don't learn anything about the world. The world's not represented. Okay. So the phenomenology of olfactory experience, what it's like, is that it lacks transparency. It lacks the capacity for occlusion. It lacks also temporality. In fact, I'm not really going to talk about this very much, I don't think. And it seems to lack the attributiveness, which is a part of the phenomenology of visual experience. So there's a weak and a strong implication of this, right? So weakly, we could say, well, olfaction gives us at best impoverished information about the world. So maybe it's not entirely unintentional. Maybe we can get information about the world from olfaction, but it doesn't allow us to identify by itself individual objects. Or we could have a much stronger view, which a lot of philosophers in the past have seemed to suggest, that it just doesn't give us any information about the world at all. In the sense we're talking about, it's non-representational. It doesn't represent the world to us in experience, as vision does. And I've gone through a lot of this quite quickly, and you might have various qualms about how the notion of representation is being understood, and so there are lots of problems here, which I'm only going to have time to sort of skate over a bit and gesture at, but we can come back to these in discussion. So in contrast to visual experience, olfactory experience is ephemeral, right, and its objects appear to be ephemeral rather than solid. It's indeterminate, right, odors just seem to be indeterminately located in some sense, as non-representational. Therefore, it doesn't allow olfactory experience to play any cognitive role in giving us knowledge about the world, and lacks the capacity for occlusion, which just follows from its other failures. Okay. Now, as far as aesthetics goes, I mean, we can talk about this in the discussion, but Roger Scruton, for instance, has written that because of this impoverished informational capacity of olfaction, that smells and tastes, as he talks about them, just don't have the capacity to sustain aesthetic interest. Why is that? Because he thinks that aesthetic interest is essentially, well, has an important cognitive dimension. Aesthetic objects allow us to linger on them, to pay attention. They're representational, they give us information about the world. And he thinks mere properties of experience, they might give you some kind of sensational pleasure, but sensational pleasure is not the same as aesthetic interest. But I don't think I have time to go through Scruton's claims in detail, but we can come back to them in the discussion if you like. Okay. So he thinks we don't have anything to discuss, basically. So when we think about objects of high aesthetic appreciation, the great artworks and so on, these have a kind of cognitive content that allows us to reason about them, to make judgments about them. They represent the world to us in various ways. That's where aesthetic value really lies. Whereas when you're talking about things, according to Scruton, like wine or perfumes, you're just talking about mere preference, what you like. There's no genuine aesthetic value there. There's nothing to reason about, nothing to really judge. That's the idea. So smells lack the kind of organizational structure that allows you to talk about them in a meaningful way. Well, I mean, so I would say that that's in a way been historically the predominant view of olfaction, although it hasn't usually been articulated very, very clearly. But recently Claire Batty has defended the representational capacity of olfaction, but in a very weak form, and so I'm going to insist that it's not quite right. So she says, unlike visual experiences which represent particular objects as being located at particular places, olfactory experience reports merely that properties are instantiated by objects, just not by particular ones. Okay? So rather they're instantiated just by some object or other at some rough location around me. So when I smell something, I smell, let's say I have the smell of lemon in my nose or mint, all I can say of that experience, of its content, is that, well, I smelled something minty, or I smelled something lemony. But by itself, that experience doesn't represent the object, right, of those odors to me, right, the object of which those odors are properties. So she says, olfactory experience predicates properties to something we know not what, at the undifferentiated location of here, i.e. around me or in my nose. So on the abstract view, then, olfactory experience represents that there was something or other here with certain properties, but no more than that. Okay. So it's weakly representational. And because of this, Batty thinks, in olfaction we can't solve what she refers to as the many properties problem. Okay. So that's the problem of distinguishing between scenes in which the same properties are instantiated in different arrangement. So here's an example she gives. When I spray lavender air freshener to try and mask the smell of cigarette smoke, I do not experience the lavender smell at one location and the smoke smell at another. For example, in the circumstance in which the locations are the same as the lavender smell being right on top of the smoke smell. Nor does it seem plausible to suggest that there might be a different circumstance in which my olfactory experience reports that the air freshener smell is on top of some of the smoke smell, but that I missed the spot. As I sit in the room, I am unable to tell the difference between a circumstance in which I cover the whole room and a circumstance in which I miss the spot. Now, I mean, what's quite striking about all of these philosophical observations of olfactory experience, and for that matter of visual experience, is that they're essentially phenomenological reports, right? So how experiences seem to you, okay? So in a way, it's very kind of armchair philosophy. And insofar as it is sort of armchair phenomenological speculations about one's inner experiences, it's a sufficient objection to any of these views to note that your experience might be different. Well, it's some kind of objection. Maybe if you find enough people, it starts becoming a more substantial objection. Now, of course, these kinds of observations might strike you as intuitively plausible, but they don't strike me as that plausible in thinking about some of our olfactory experiences. And in particular, I'm going to talk a little bit about wine, the experience of wine. Anyway, because of this many properties problem, we might also think that this is related to the inability of olfaction to accommodate the occlusion, right? Because because smells have no spatial location on this view, it makes no sense to think that one could be hidden or be below or behind another, right? That we can tell from the experience. Okay, and I think that might be wrong. So this is the second problem I'm going to address. So the many properties problem I will say something about, but I don't have much time here. And it's a bit more complicated than I thought when I first started thinking about this. So I don't have any knockdown objections to this, but I have some worries with it. I'm going to be a bit more concerned with this problem, which is, I'm just going to call the source object problem. So the idea is that olfaction, even if directed at and being representative of odours, does not by itself represent the source object of those odours. Okay? And the idea is that this requires either genuinely representational senses and or some sort of cognition. So this follows from some of the quotes we've already looked at, but just in more detail. So compare these two statements. I smell the cheese in the kitchen, and I smell the odour of cheese filling the kitchen, or I smell a cheesy odour around me. So which is right? Well, most of the views that we've looked at so far more or less assume that the second one is right. Okay. So in any case, these are not equivalent. I mean, as should be obvious, they have different olfactory objects. Right? Either the cheese that's emitting the odor or the odor that's emitted by the cheese. So what exactly is the object of olfaction? Is it the cheesy odors around me, or is it the cheese giving off the odors? And most philosophers have thought, well, it's the odors that are the object. Olfaction by itself can't tell you that there's cheese there that's emitting the source of the odors. Why? Because for that you need sight, right? You need to see the fondue giving you the odors of cheese. Okay. And this is just because of these 2 points, which I've already mentioned. Smells can linger without their source objects being able to be tracked and identified. So the capacity of odors to linger in a room after their source objects, for instance, have been removed, has been taken by philosophers to show that the object, or at least it's one piece of evidence for thinking that the object of olfaction are the odors rather than the source objects that emit them. And the identification, therefore, of those source objects requires other sense modalities like vision. Right? You need to locate the fondue by vision, or perhaps by touch or by hearing, or cognition, right? Perhaps by forming a belief on the basis of testimony that there is fondue that's causing your smell. Now, when I was reading this literature, I found all of this incredibly bizarre and counterintuitive, so I don't know how other people find it. But here's what Richardson has said in a recent paper. She says, had I not the ability to recognize this odor as that characteristically produced by roses, and were I not also able to see the roses in the room, my olfactory experience would be no guide at all to the presence of roses in my vicinity. I could just as easily conclude that there was something else rose-scented about, such as air freshener or a perfume-wearing friend. So you can see the way in which this kind of view just goes together with all of the other views we've looked at, which just want to say, in one way or another, that olfaction fails to represent, or represents only in a very attenuated, vague, indeterminate kind of way. Right? So olfaction doesn't really tell us about the world by itself. Well, one thing I want to say to this is, this strikes me as incredibly counterintuitive, and it just can't be right. Okay? If that were right, it would be literally wrong to say that we can smell, for instance, the wine, because we can literally only smell the odors it emits and not their source. But of course we do say, I smell the wine, or I smell the fondue. We might say, I smell the odor of the fondue. We might say, I have a fondue smell in my nose at the moment. We can say these things. But I mean, an explanation is surely owed of why it's more natural to say, I smell the object that's emitting those odors. Right? I smell the fondue. And after all, olfaction does clearly, as we've heard over the last 24 hours, play a really important role in our experiential lives, and a role that's very important in our evolutionary history for survival and for all sorts of things. So if you wonder whether the milk in your fridge is spoiled, you most likely put it under your nose and sniff it. Okay? And if you can't identify by sight alone which spice is in the jar, then smelling it will obviously help you find out. So you might think that just contrary to these kinds of views, to the view of Richardson I've just put up, that it seems that odor sources are not necessarily identified through other source modalities or through cognition, but that actually olfaction must do at least some of that work itself. Okay? And in some of these cases, it looks like only olfaction will do. Okay? So smell must have some sort of representational content that contains, as part of it, in the individual source objects. Okay, so here are the aims for the rest of the talk. I think I have about 20 minutes. Is that all right? Okay. Okay. So first I want to show that odours can be quasi-spatially structured, at least in certain odorous objects like wine, in such a way that they allow for features like, for instance, occlusion. I'd like to also show that in such cases there can be property binding of a sort that doesn't fall prey to the many properties problem, and to show that olfaction can by itself therefore represent source objects, individual objects in the world. It can do some individuating work like visual experience. And from all of these things follows a strong claim about the representational capacity of olfaction, which is much richer than many philosophers have seemed to think. The argument, however, is disappointing because it does amount to a series of observations, which I'm just going to gesture at because I don't have a huge amount of time in this talk, about the nature of our experience of wine, right, and how we talk about wine and think about the properties that wine has in olfactory experience. Okay, and in addition to this, I'm going to just look at and defend the idea of cognitive penetration of olfactory experience. I think once you start allowing cognitive penetration, then the richness of olfactory experience follows, or we just get into a verbal dispute about characterizing perceptual experiences apart from the cognitive factors that might or might not penetrate them. And of course, some philosophers deny that there is such a thing as cognitive penetration. So I don't have time to engage with all of the arguments for and against cognitive penetration. Here, I'm just going to gesture at the implications for this debate if one does accept that there is such a thing as cognitive penetration. And basically, the method here will be to diffuse the purported disanalogies between olfaction and vision that philosophers have pointed to ground their criticism of the capacity of olfaction. Okay. So I hope that's clear-ish, but I realize it's not as clear as it could be. So hopefully it'll become clear as I go. So here's the claim I want to defend. Wine is a complex structure of odours, the olfactory experience of which, i.e. the odours, allows us to represent, identify and individuate the wine objects of which they're properties. This odorous structure exhibits olfactory analogues of the spatial structure of visual experience, including the characteristics of occlusion and temporality. I haven't really talked about the temporality of vision. Temporality here is only important insofar as some philosophers have been concerned not just to contrast vision with olfaction, but also to contrast olfaction with audition, and to say that audition, like visual experience, can be genuinely representational, can do some individuating work, and so on. And partly this is done in virtue of the temporal structure that sounds can have. And as far as aesthetic implications go, Roger Scruton, for instance, has argued that sounds, unlike smells, have the capacity to be the bearers of meaning and expression and to have cognitive content because they can be structurally ordered in a temporal way. At least that's one of the elements that allows them to satisfy our aesthetic interest. I've never really figured out what exactly is the salient difference between, say, sounds considered as the objects of audition and smells as the object of olfaction in a way that reflects badly on olfactory experience. So I'm not going to go into that in detail here. So these kinds of characteristics, amongst others, are what allow essentially odorous objects like wine to be the bearer of significant aesthetic values, but I'm not going to talk about that in this talk. Okay, so here's just some ways of pointing to the kinds of things we say and the kind of way our experience seems to be when we pay attention to and try to appreciate wine, for example. So tasters typically talk in terms of different olfactory and gustatory elements of the wine. We talk of the fruit and the vegetable and the mineral and the oaky elements. Okay, we say lots of different things about all of these elements. We say that wines can smell chemically or vegetal or any number of things. So we talk of different olfactory notes, primary and tertiary. And of course this has a grounding, as I think I come to in the next slide, in terms of the volatility of molecules that we've already heard many times about now. So we talk of the body of the wine, we talk of the kind of visceral structure of the wine, the kind of structure it needs to have good mouthfeel, okay? So we talk about texture of the wine on the palate. And these are not by themselves, of course, olfactory. These are experiences of texture, but they're very closely bound up with the way in which we think about our olfactory experience of wine. So we talk about all of these complex elements that are put together in a way to make wine drinkable at worst, and at best an object of pleasure and interest. We can pay attention to these qualities as being structured in a particular way. Because after all, the elements that make up a complex odorous object like wine are deliberately arranged, and at least to some degree. So wines are made with a certain intention to exhibit certain characteristics, and insofar as they do that successfully, that represents an achievement on behalf of the winemaker. Okay. And these, well, I'm not going to go through all of the properties that people attribute to wine, but they're evaluative and non-evaluative, and they cover a vast range of aesthetic and descriptive properties, amongst others. Okay. So this is just a way of pointing at the possibility of odors to be structured in certain objects like wine, and that's a structure that's reflected in the way we talk about it and the way in which our experience presents the object to us. So I'm going to talk now about temporal and spatial structures. So one of the obvious ways in which odors in wine are structured is in terms of temporality. Okay, so we talk of first and second nosings, of the middle palate, of attack and finish. Wines change and develop, their odors change and develop depending on their volatility. So these are characteristics of odors that we've met many times now already. So one question that rises here is, does this talk correspond accurately to some kind of objective temporal development and succession in the world? Well, yes, because there's chemical volatility. That just seems to be an objective fact about the things that cause our experience. So some of the qualities intrinsic to wine are qualities of order and temporal transition. So if nothing else, odors can be temporally structured in such a way that is reflected, manifested in our olfactory experience, which already seems to lend olfactory experience some kind of representational capacity and some kind of mereological complexity, at least temporally, and at least for objects like wine. But what about spatial structure? Well, this is a bit more controversial, I guess. And I'm not quite sure exactly what I want to say about this, but it looks like we do attribute. So a lot of this talk will strike you as just metaphorical. I'm going to address this in a few minutes. So I think we do attribute spatial properties and orderings to smells in wine. So we often say things like, I can detect the buttery oakiness lurking beneath the first powerful layer of fruit, for instance, or the steely minerality is filled within the velvety floral mid-palate. So whatever you think of this way of describing wines, we do talk about wines in this way, and it does seem to make some sense of how we experience them. Okay. And I don't think this is just temporal. I do think there's a genuinely spatial or pseudo-spatial element to our experience of odors in this way. And this is because even if we do experience them temporally, necessarily as volatile compounds, we can nevertheless place these characteristics in something like an olfactory space, right? Whether we conceive of that as being in our nose or our mouth, or even in the glass. And we can go back over this space again and again to pay attention to those characteristics. Okay. So the claim I would like to make, although I know I haven't given sufficient arguments to really defend it in detail, is that it does appear to us in phenomenology to be at least quasi-spatial when we taste the various ways in which the properties of wine can be ordered. Probably because we naturally think of this as an olfactory field before the nose and or around the palate. And odors do, after all, take up some space, and because we closely, and I think in a way that we can talk genuinely of representation, we associate, although that's not quite the right word, the stuff in the glass that we're drinking with the experience that we're having of the stuff in the glass that's causing our experience. I say a bit more about that in a second. Okay. So here's a fairly tentative way of putting what I want to say. And we could say that olfactory experience of complex odorous objects like wine is kind of spatio-temporal or pseudo-spatial, insofar as phenomenologically it appears to us that the way in which odours are structured in a complex object like wine take up some room, used metaphorically if you like, in a spatial olfactory field. Now, one quick thing to say here is just that there doesn't seem to be any obvious reason for it to accept that spatial ordering, as opposed to, say, the temporal ordering we get when we smell wines, should be a necessary condition on the representation of olfactory particulars. So this is a bit of a dig at the way in which this debate between olfaction and vision arises. Right? So people have just assumed, because they take vision as their model, that we need something like the spatial ordering we get in visual experience to individuate objects at all. And that when we talk of the representation of perceptual experience, that's just what we mean, that representation must have that kind of spatial ordering. So some philosophers have really said this. But that just seems to be a bad assumption, right? And it certainly doesn't seem to be the kind of thing that one should extend across all of the sense modalities. There just seems to be no reason to accept that the kind of individuation we get in olfactory experience needs to be subject to exactly the same kinds of spatial conditions we get in vision. In fact, if you think about it, it seems to be a bit mad to assume otherwise. Okay, so recall this many properties problem, the way in which it's denied that in olfaction we can have layerings as if smells are on top of each other, and that we can distinguish different objects even if we have the same smell or odorous components for each object. So here's what I want to say about this, and I know it's not an argument, but it's just a kind of pointing to. I mean, if we do talk about wine in this way, and if we do think of our olfactory experience of complex odorous objects like wine in the way that I've suggested, then I think in these cases that this kind of observation about the many properties problem is just false. Okay? So I think we can place odors in some kind of quasi-spatial temporal relation to each other, and possibly in a way that allows us to think of them as occluded. Right? So when I talk of smells or flavors in wine lurking beneath other smells and flavors in wine, I think there's something to that. I think there's at least an olfactory analog of occlusion that's going on there. But I don't really know what more to say about it than that. And harmony. Okay? So wine can fail to live up to the complexity, for instance, detected on the first nose, when eventually it's circulated around the palates, or for that matter garnered by prior knowledge of its production and the intentions of the winemaker, or the typical style of this kind of wine. And it can also promise such complexity and after some time deliver it or exceed it, for example. Now arguably we can even detect absences in wine, but I'm really not sure that this is the best way of putting it. But it's certainly controversial whether we can perceive absences or not. Some philosophers think we can. One way in which the idea can plausibly be applied in this case is in the tasting of something like the potential development of the wine. Right? So expert tasters can, as it were, smell and taste latent properties in a wine, determine more or less vaguely how these might develop and mature, and predict the aging potential and olfactory development of the wine. Now, I guess it's controversial how much success they have in doing this. But insofar as it can be done, this at least raises the question whether smelling latent properties or potential development in the wine is the same thing as kind of smelling an absence. And then this leads to another question, which is maybe unanswerable, of whether this kind of smelling an absence is a type of occlusion. But I'm just going to gesture at that and throw it out there, and you can think about it. I'm not really sure what to say about it. Well, so here's one objection one might make to everything I've said so far. Well, all of this talk about occlusion in olfaction and the structuring of odors and layering and temporality, this is all just metaphors. It's just a way of talking. It's a way of trying to make sense of our olfactory experience, but it's really not literally applied. Right? In the case of visual experience, we're literally representing things, and we're talking very literally about the representational capacity of our experience in vision. Okay? Well, I think this kind of objection is just irrelevant, actually, to the issue. Why? Because insofar as they appear in our perception to be of a spatial-like nature, and insofar as these spatial metaphors are an ineliminable part of our olfactory experiences and judgments, I think we can justly say that olfaction can involve a quasi-spatial as well as temporal structure and ordering, and hence satisfy some of the purported main conditions for representation and for individuation of objects. And you might think this is a poor response, but I think given that, as I said, the debate rests almost, if not entirely, on phenomenological observations about the nature of visual experience, this kind of observation should be enough to at least give you pause for thought, that olfaction can't involve the same kinds of elements, or at least analogous elements to vision in terms of its representational capacity. But it's obviously not sufficient, so I need to say something now about something very quick, in fact, about cognitive penetration. So not only one might think that all of this talk about olfactory properties and wine tasting is metaphorical, one might also point quite rightly to the fact that some kind of conventions and expertise are needed in order to do this, in order to supposedly represent wine objects as involving this complex structured layer of olfactory properties, whereas in vision we just go around seeing things, okay, without having to think much about it, without needing expertise. In vision it just looks like we're more or less born with the capacity to individuate objects and to represent them in a spatially layered way. Right, so that's right, in some sense that's right, of course. So when you're talking about wine tasting, it requires some practice and some expertise, and you might say that the kind of talk we engage in, that I've just engaged in, requires an assumption that we have something like cognitive penetration in our olfactory experiences, which is just a fancy way of saying that background knowledge influences what we smell and how we characterize our olfactory experiences. Well, here's a recent way of putting the cognitive penetration claim from Susanna Siegel. She says, if visual experience is cognitively penetrable, then it is nomoologically possible for two subjects, or for one subject in different counterfactual circumstances or at different times, to have visual experiences with different contents while seeing the same distal stimuli under the same external conditions as a result of differences in other cognitive, including affective states. So there's a debate about whether there is such a thing as cognitive penetration. And we can discuss that later if you like. I'm not going to get into that now. I'm going to just assume that it's true and see what follows. Well, if you accept cognitive penetration, then it seems to me there's no reason to accept that olfactory experience by itself cannot represent the particular source objects of odours, right? Particularly the case with essentially odorous objects like wine and perfume. The phenomenology is hard to articulate, but I think that then olfactory experience itself can appear to us as transparent, attributive, even spatial. So when I'm drinking a wine, when I'm smelling a wine, I think that it's through the olfactory experience. The olfactory experience is sufficient to tell me that what I'm drinking is that stuff in there. That's what I think. So here's the claim. So at least in the case of essentially odorous objects, there is no good reason to think that our cognitively penetrated olfactory experiences do not by themselves represent the wine object as the object we are smelling via its odors. Okay. So we have the source-object problem again, so this is the objection to the claim I'm making. Remember, so at best olfaction, people say, represents objects indirectly via the mediation of cognition or other sense modalities. Why? Because odors, remember, can come apart from their source objects. So there's nothing, as it were, in olfaction itself to guarantee that these odors are that object there, or coming from that object there. We need sight to tell us that it's that wine in the glass. Okay. So the idea is that our olfactory experiences can actually represent this particular wine as opposed to just some generally located array of odors. We need vision, for example, to do that. So I've just got 3 responses to this before I finish up, and I hope you find them more or less convincing. Well, so you might just say, well, vision too is cognitively penetrated, can be cognitively penetrated, maybe is entirely cognitively penetrated, and can require cognition in order to differentiate certain objects. So a lot of common examples here, Susanna Siegel talks of pine trees, right? So if I don't know what pine trees are and then I learn what a pine tree is, I can learn to distinguish pine trees from other trees that maybe look like pine trees, and that my visual experiences are actually different once I learn what a pine tree is. So this is a kind of case of seeing as, right? A kind of case of aspect perception. And some philosophers have thought that all perception, all visual perception is aspect perception. Now I think that's probably not true, but I think a huge amount is. And so a lot of visual experiences too can only individuate objects in virtue of being cognitively penetrated. So in cases of cognitive penetration, olfactory experience by itself can include a cognitive component. Okay, and that's just what cognitive penetration tells us. So if that's the case, then there is no great disanalogy between those olfactory experiences which are cognitively penetrated and in virtue of which we experience objects like wine, and visual experiences which are also cognitively penetrated in which we experience the pine tree there as a pine tree. And then I think we're in danger maybe of just having a verbal dispute about what counts as an olfactory experience, or a visual experience for that matter. In fact, I don't think that's right. I probably shouldn't have said that. There is a danger there, but it's not as prominent really as that. It's really a more interesting dispute about how we should think of cognitive penetration and the role it plays in identifying and individuating objects. And finally, just because odours can linger and can appear apart from their source objects doesn't entail that they must. So in the case of drinking this wine, they are not, in the relevant sense, experienced apart. Now this is a very weak part of my talk. I mean, what I want to say, of course, is that olfactory experience by itself represents the wine here, the source object of the odours that I'm smelling. And in a way, this is just a phenomenological claim, and it may not, I don't know if anyone else finds it plausible, but what I want to say is wine perception has both the odours and the object as its intentional object. Phenomenologically, it doesn't seem to me that even if I can think of the wine odours as lingering without their source object, that in the actual experience of locating them in that object, which is the glass in front of me, even if vision plays a role in telling me at the very start of the overall experience that there is a glass of wine in front of me, it's olfaction that does the work in identifying the wine object. Why? Because the wine object is essentially constituted of odours, and that's how we go about identifying and representing it. So one way of putting this, I guess, would be to say that the wine object as represented in vision is just different from the wine object as represented in olfaction. They play different representational roles. Okay.
I just had a question about the occlusion, your defense of occlusion, and it's really just to support your point.
Yeah.
I mean, I think it seems to me occlusion is really something that's such a characteristic or a feature of the visual. And again, I wonder whether you really even need, I mean, I think you sort of pointed to this possibility, you really even need to deal with that objection, because it's, you know, the sense in which, you know, we could talk about the spatial sort of aspect of smells as you know, seeming to be, you know, again, a complex smell, or two different smells coming together in a, you know, just like we did in the smell walk this morning, one being fainter and one being stronger. So I, you know, of course I don't know wine tasting, so I can't really capture or understand what it would mean for something to be behind another.
Yeah.
But I think someone will come along and say, well, one's just stronger and one's just weaker.
Yeah.
You know, and so why would you even need to go down the occlusion line, and can't you just talk about stronger and weaker and sort of complex smellscape or something like that?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. I mean, I wasn't very clear about the exact claim I wanted to defend, because I'm very unclear about the exact claim I wanted to defend. I mean, certainly to defend the representational capacity of olfaction, I don't need to really defend occlusion. I said something about occlusion because when I wrote the abstract for this talk, I'd been thinking about some of the claims made about olfaction. And it struck me as quite interesting that there seem to be cases of olfaction that involve something very like spatial occlusion, or at least somehow analogous to. It's quite hard to talk of this. I mean, when I talk about the sort of spatiality of odours, it's meant to be partly metaphorical, but it is meant to represent a way of making sense of the phenomenology. And so you can call it spatial, I'd call it quasi-spatial, in order to indicate that it's a sort of analogue of the spatial ordering in vision. Occlusion, I don't know what to say about it, other than it does seem to me that there are certain olfactory experiences we can have, and I'm particularly thinking, of course, of in the wine case, where it seems that we are detecting layers, but layers in a way that allows for some kind of occlusion. Sometimes we talk about this in ordinary experience of one smell masking another. And it's almost like you get a sign of the smell. Now you're right, of course, one might just reduce all that kind of talk into talk of intensity. So instead of saying, well, the lavender masks the smell of the bleach or whatever, well, it just so happens that both smells are kind of lingering around, and one smell is just stronger than the other. Okay, so I can smell a bit of bleach, but I can smell a lot more lavender. And then you could say, well, we just talk in a rough kind of way about the lavender masking the bleach. But I'm not so sure in cases of complex odorous objects like wine that have been deliberately made in a way. I mean, once we're aware, so this goes to a part of the talk I didn't really get to do with aesthetic values in particular. But once we're aware of the intentions to make wines in certain ways, and once that awareness of intention informs our experience via kind of cognitive penetration, then I think it's more than just a sort of empty metaphor to talk about smells masking each other or being layered in ways where we can detect that there's a kind of smell beneath that we're not quite getting at, but that we can see will come through, as it were. It's quite hard to talk about this in an articulate way, but I think it's more than, in those cases, it's at least more than just differing intensities of odors. There seems to be a structuring that allows for something analogous to occlusion. But I agree that it might only be as strong as an analogy and nothing like the kind, I mean, not enough like the occlusion in spatiality to call it occlusion. Maybe we should call it something else.
Yeah, so if you
I'm
do
unsure
go
what to say.
down the layering line, then you're sort of say that it may offer something, in the olfactory case, something like occlusion, but not occlusion.
Yeah. I mean, I should have apologized more, but part of the problem with this talk is that in the much longer version, I go through in detail, looking at examples of wine tasting and exploring how these are made. But I just thought I didn't have time here, so I just tell you that in wine it's like this, and you either buy it or you don't, and Barry's about not to buy it.
No, I buy it, and I like the conclusion. I think we agree. I'm just trying to get clear about the ways you get there and the arguments, the strength of the arguments for getting there.
Yeah.
There's something that slightly worries me, and that is that you keep talking about when you try to get the spatial sense, locating, in the wine case, locating the odors. I'm not sure you locate the odors, you locate the source of the odors. I mean, when you talk about getting this from the wine, there's a sense in which I stop paying attention to where the odors are, and insofar as I'm thinking about it as a piece of objective perception of qualities of the wine, I'm very much thinking of them as in the wine. Now that may be that I've kind of joined together a bit of perception and cognition and got there, and there's some sort of blend, but it doesn't seem to me that I locate them, I mean, in the headspace. I mean, this high, that high. Do I really think that the more volatile elements are coming higher out of the glass? Well, with champagne, you really can do it because you know exactly, you feel on your face where the bubbles are popping, and so that's right. But normally, you don't locate the odors, so I'm wondering whether that will really work for you.
Yeah, well, I mean, this is grist to my mill in a way. I mean, because this would be a way of describing olfactory experience, at least in the cases of attributing properties to wine, which is in a way directly intentional, right? I mean, it's representational. It's you're not thinking of these, or it doesn't appear to you in your experience to be the case that these are properties of your experience. They're properties of the stuff in there that you're drinking. So I think that's absolutely right. Now, the problem is you can just say that. But then you have these people who talk about olfactory experience in a way that seems to disallow that way of talking.
So we don't have to worry about what they disallow, we just have to think of how good their reasons are. But it would then make the spatial sense closer to audition than to vision.
Okay.
Because audition doesn't locate sounds, auditory perception locates the source of sounds.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know where sounds are. Are they here, my ear? Are they your mouth when you talk? Are they in between us? I don't know.
Yeah.
I get no answer to that. But I can. Auditory perception seems to, of course, that can go wrong. Seems to locate sources. So this would be the sense in which that's what your claim is. And even in cases where you suddenly smell a funny smell in your home, you want to locate the source. You're kind of moving backwards and forwards, and you're not sure where where the odours are, but you're pretty sure there's a source of the odour, and that's what you're trying to locate.
Yeah, the problem is that people like Richardson and Batty and so on will say, well, it's not olfaction itself that does the work of locating the source. It can give some indication that there is a source, but you need the other sense modalities or cognition of some sort to do it.
They're wrong about that for a particular empirical reason.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, if you, work done by Murphy and then I think repeated by Gottfried, if you strap an artificial septum onto people's faces, which blares the nostrils out very far apart, blindfolded people then get to about 70 or 80% accuracy for direction of odour. And the trouble is their nostrils are just not far enough apart to do this usually. And again, it's like binaural hearing, right? Yeah. So it's very similar to audition. So
that's interesting. Also because, I mean, I take it most of these claims are directed at human olfactory capacities. But of course, you wouldn't want to make the kind of claims they do about olfaction in general, right? Because there must be animals who locate.
So yeah, but what's really nice is I think it's a very philosophical question. So Gottfried asks, when you strap on this equipment, does this give you a new ability or does it uncover an ability that you weren't using? Yeah. And it looks like the answer should be the latter, right? Yeah. I mean, it'd be very funny if it just gave you a new ability.
Yeah. No, that's interesting. Thanks for that. I mean, just quickly on the audition stuff. I just don't know what to say about sounds. I mean, I haven't thought carefully enough about it, and I find them puzzling. What's quite interesting is, so in the longer version of this, I had stuff about audition, because a lot of the philosophers who make these claims about olfaction don't just have visual experiences as their only paradigm, they also talk about audition as having some of the representational capacities they think olfaction lacks. So Scruton talks about this, and I think Richardson talks about this. Batty certainly makes some of these remarks as well. And they always struck me as odd, because it does seem that it's just as questionable, if it is questionable, whether audition represents sounds as whether olfaction represents whether audition represents the source objects of sound as whether olfaction can represent the source objects of odours. Because it just seems to me that there's no obvious disanalogy between olfaction and audition in this respect. And Scruton says a lot of things about this that just don't strike me as true, really. That because sounds can be temporally ordered, therefore they have this kind of cognitive content that olfaction can't have, but there's no reason to think they can't. I mean, because olfaction can obviously represent odours as structured in a similar way. So, yeah, I've never really understood the salient difference between audition and olfaction in respective representation. But I don't know what to think about sounds, really.
I have a question. Yeah. Actually, I have a couple of them, but let me be brief. So, about cognitive penetration. Yeah. So let's say it's true. What follows from that for your argument? So you say if there is cognitive penetration, then the chances that olfactory experience is representational go high. I guess you have to face at least these two objections to convince us that that's the case, right? One is, well, what happens there is that there is some sort of cross-modality going on. As you said, sometimes it's not just the olfactory experience, it's also the visual experience, maybe the tactile experience. And what you have there is not really cognitive penetration of perception, but actually perception penetration of perception, if you know what I mean.
You mean cross-modality in the sense that...
So it's not really the concepts, it's, there are pathways of information. The information processing is indeed complex, but it's not that it's coming from some particular cognitive domain, it's actually coming from some still perceptual domain. So that's one way of objecting to your line of argument. And the other is as to say, it is indeed cognitive, but what you're actually characterizing as an olfactory experience is actually not an olfactory experience, it's an olfactory judgment. So how do you deal with those two things?
Yeah, exactly. So can I take the second objection first? Sure. So the second objection is kind of what I had in mind when I gestured to this maybe being a verbal dispute. Now, I mean, that's not quite right. It's not a verbal dispute. So the dispute at issue here is whether, if there is cognitive penetration, the kinds of experiences that result from that are experiences we want to call just olfactory experiences, or whether they can be olfactory judgments. Is that the idea?
Yeah, I asked that because it's usually, for people who defend cognitive penetration, that's the standard objection. So they say, well, maybe if you agree that that's...
All right, sorry, I misunderstood. So your second objection is an objection against cognitive penetration, not against the idea.
Well, I was asking how would you deal with that kind of objection to actually bring cognitive penetration to your argument, so that that's the work that you wanted to do?
No, I see.
Okay, sorry.
No, that's okay. So in that case, that just strikes me as then the dispute about whether there is cognitive penetration or not, because the opponents of cognitive penetration, well, they have a number of lines of attack. One of them is the one you've suggested, which is that really these are judgments rather than perceptual experiences themselves. Well, then we can get into a debate about whether there's cognitive penetration or not.
So you think that's equivalent to actually questioning the very idea of cognitive penetration?
I think so, yeah. And another way of doing it is to say that the supposed examples of cognitive penetration are really just people who are more expert or have different background knowledge or beliefs pay more attention, for instance, to the object. And I mean, there are moves one can make in this debate on each side, which obviously I didn't go into.
Sure.
And we could have an argument about that. So it's true that this turns on whether there is cognitive penetration or not. So the first question, whether it's multi-sensory rather than a genuine sense of cognitive penetration.
For instance.
I mean, I don't know. I mean, there's another thing. I'm never quite sure what to say about multi-sensory experiences. I mean, I don't see why it would be a problem for me if a lot of these experiences turned out to be multi-sensory rather than involving penetration, because then the notion of which perceptual modality is doing the actual representative work becomes a sort of open question, right? I mean, so
actually, that's precisely my point. I don't think you buying into cognitive penetration gets you, any return. That's right. So, I mean, my general thought was...
Why do you think that?
Well, because as you said, it doesn't really matter, right? Imagine that there is no cognitive penetration, that there is something closer to what, I don't know, Ophelia de Roy defends, it's something like, there is no big divide there, cognitive and then perceptual. It's all sort of like messy and blurry, and it's more like perception. Already...
I think it's messy, but it's more like the kinds of experiences I want to talk about here are more like, I mean, if there's a difference, they're more like cognitive penetration than they are like multisensoriality. I mean, they might involve both. So I'm drinking the wine, I'm looking at the wine, I'm sniffing the wine. Now, you might say there's a kind of overall multisensory experience that represents the wine object via the odors that I have. That's a kind of complex mixture of vision and smell and touch and taste and maybe some other things. And I'm sure that's right. Now, then one can say, well, what's doing the representational work is some overarching multi-sensory experience. So one could say that. Or another thing to do would be, and I'm not sure how useful this issue is, but you could then try to just differentiate the elements and say, well, the visual representation is representing this, the olfaction is representing that. So I mean, I don't know what to say about that. I mean, I assume that...
Sure.
But I need cognitive penetration because I need certainly in the case of experiencing complex odorous objects like wine as being structured and rich representationally in the kind of way I want, requires a kind of background of beliefs, expectations, familiarities that are not just perceptual, because you need to sort of interpret the object in a kind of way, right? I mean, it's not just given to you. You need to know where to pay attention. You need a way to know how to describe those experiences even to yourself, to differentiate different elements of it, which involves perception, but I think not just perception. I don't think multi-sensory experiences are going to give you enough to justify the idea that olfaction by itself can represent. That's my thought.
Sure. I was cheeky there. Sorry.
Well, I've got two questions, and the first would be, according to your perspective, which role has language in all this background? And the other one would be, and what happens with the body? Are we talking about something cognitive that it's only mental or body has something to say with all this? Because according to what I've heard, I'm not sure if body does or does not have a crucial role.
Our body?
Yes, our body. What happens to this?
Okay, so the first question is about language.
Yes.
So, I don't know, so there's an interesting issue here, I suppose. I think that there are people in the room who know more about this than I do. There's an interesting issue about whether the inability to say, articulate your olfactory experiences or to put names to odors may hinder your ability to detect them. Or you can detect them in some sense without, well, how do you put this? So you sense them without being able to represent them in experience or so. I'm not really sure how to put it. I mean, I guess there are a number of ways you could go here. But I don't know what the right answer to this is. I mean, I suppose in some sense, when I'm sniffing a glass of wine, if I don't have a good vocabulary to describe what I'm smelling, then maybe there are some odors that I fail to detect, in some sense of detect. Or it could be that I detect them in some basic physiological sense. They enter my experience, but because I lack the names to put to them, they don't really figure in my conscious awareness or characterization of my experience or something like this. I don't know really how to put this stuff. So there are a number of ways you could go here with the role of language. So I don't know if that answers your question, but there are some interesting issues here that I don't really know the answer to. The second one about the role of the body. I mean, is your thought that cognition in general is embodied, or at least partly embodied, and so when I'm talking about the difference between cognition and perception,
yes,
the body has to play?
My claim would be that there is no cognition without the body.
Right.
It's a crucial part.
Right. I suppose that's kind of literally true. But you might worry about this in a way that undermines the distinction that you think I need between cognition and perception, for example, or perceptual experience, or something like that. So you might think that all bodily experiences, all perceptual experiences are bodily experiences, and all bodily experiences are cognitive experiences in some sense of cognition, some broad sense of cognition, because cognition is necessarily embodied. I mean, if that's the idea, I guess I can...
In a rough way, yes.
Okay.
Let's say that, yes.
Well, then I can probably agree with that, but I also think it is worth keeping in mind some distinction between cognitive elements and non-cognitive elements, for lots of reasons. And certainly, if you got rid of that, then it may help my cause. I'd have to think more about it.
Okay.
But
Thank you. Well, I have I don't know, perhaps a silly question, but it seems to me that most of your examples for articulating this, all the conditions that would be required for olfactory kind of factor representation rely heavily on these wine experiences.
yeah.
And it occurs to me that perhaps these are not the kind of experiences that the ordinary people in the street may have.
Yeah.
So,
or the philosophers, for instance, writing about olfaction have in mind. They're not the kinds of experiences I don't think that the philosophers writing on olfaction generally have in mind either.
All right, okay. So, I imagine someone that might think that there is this analogy between visual experience and, these kind of very specific experiences.
Yeah.
In that, visual experience is a property of ordinary people, and these kind of olfactory experiences, the identification of odors and tastes and the experience of wine are a kind of very specific and expert-like kind of experience, and that might be, I don't know if that's a word.
Yeah. So there's an objection here, and there's a much nastier objection, and a real problem lurking here. So the one worry is, I mean, given that I have concentrated solely on wine as an example, that this might be unrepresentative of olfaction in general, and that it might be a sort of exception that does nothing to undermine general worries about the representational capacity of olfaction. Is that right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Not only of olfaction, but you know that somehow, if olfaction is representational, then it's representational in a way that is very specific. It's very specific in the way the visual experience might be representational.
You mean specific in the sense that's very different,
exceptional, rare.
Yeah.
Really. Doesn't concern the usual cognitive subject or something like that. The standard one.
So if I understand rightly, then the worry is that all I've shown by focusing on wine is that insofar as olfaction can represent, it represents in a very specific way that's so different from vision that
the specificity concerns the kind of cognitive subject. The cognitive subject is an expert one, a subject that has a very developed or a special kind of olfactory experience.
Okay.
I don't know if that's perhaps not a problem.
No, so I think there's a nasty problem lurking here, which is this. So you might say, okay, that's all very good. So olfactory experiences can be cognitively penetrated, and let's even admit that in the case of things like wine tasting, because the object that you're tasting or smelling is an olfactory complex one, that in these cases, so we can admit that in those cases there's a representational content of the wine object in a way that's at least quasi-spatial and maybe quasi-temporal or something like this. Nevertheless, you might say that all that's equivalent to in the visual experience case, so for all the analogy, the only extent to which the analogy works is with cases of, say, aspect perception, with those cases of vision that are also cognitively penetrated by people with, say, some expertise, for instance. And then you might say, but look, you have all of these visual experiences which are not cognitively penetrated and don't require any expertise whatsoever, and yet have all of these features that lead to our ability to individuate and represent objects in the world. And there is no analogy in olfaction to that. I mean, so I don't know if that was your objection, but I take it that would be an objection to my view. So we take the pine tree example as a case of supposed visual cognitive penetration. Yeah, you might say, but look, I still see pine trees. I just don't see them as pine trees. So my visual experience, in its most primitive form, still allows me to not bump into a three-dimensional object and to distinguish it from other three-dimensional objects. And you might say that the case of olfaction I've concentrated on necessarily requires some kind of cognitive penetration, and that without that, olfactory experiences don't represent individual objects at all, or only do so in a very indeterminate way. I take it that would be an objection to my...
Yeah, I think so. So just how would you respond to that?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, if you really want to press me on this, so this is something I was thinking about just yesterday. I mean, how to answer it, and I was just too tired to be bothered. It a bit goes to the sort of heart of the strategy of my overall approach, which is, what exactly is at stake here, and I mean, how is this debate run, right? So it's run on, as I said, sort of phenomenological observations of people's experiences and supposed disanalogies or differences that hold between olfaction and vision. Okay, and then I want to say, well, look, actually, there are a lot of analogies and a lot of similarities here, just enough so that we can get at least quasi-spatial and quasi-temporal analogues in the case of vision that allow, in olfaction, that allow olfaction to represent. Now, how many analogies do there have to be, and how close do they have to be for olfaction to be genuinely representational? I suppose that's what's at issue in this debate. Well, then I don't know. And then I think the debate is in danger of becoming quite boring, because we might just be sort of launching different notions of representation at each other and losing our hold on what it is to represent. And in a way, I think that is a bit of a legitimate worry. So I think at the very least, okay, here's how I answer the objection. At the very least, what I've shown is that olfactory experience has something like a representational capacity that does resemble in certain salient ways the capacities of vision to represent. And if you want to reject that, then I think you owe me a much clearer notion of what it is for a perceptual experience to be representational than the ones at issue. And much clearer examples of olfactory phenomenology that show that the kinds of things I've talked about don't characterize olfactory representationality in general, or something like that. But I know that's a very unclear response, but that's what I would gesture at.
Just the last question, Larry.
Well, I wanted to chime in and agree with Emily and with you on the issue of occlusion and the question of, it seems to me in a lot of the objections of Batty, Richardson, and so on, there's this sort of notion that they have an ideal image of vision, and therefore olfaction has to match that. It doesn't seem to me that, I don't know what the profound reasons are that olfaction has to match that.
Yeah.
I mean, why do we have different senses?
Yeah.
Then anyway, I won't go on further.
That's an important point, though. I mean, I gestured at that in the talk and to my response just now. I mean, that it can become easy to lose your grip on the importance of this debate on exactly what's at stake, because even if you take vision as a paradigm, there's no obvious reason to think that any of its characteristics should have an analogue in other sense modalities, in virtue of which we take them to represent or fail to do so.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, Barrett brought up hearing, for example. Okay. And secondly, and this maybe ties into your objection, although I'm taking the other side of it, which is the examples drawn always are drawn from kind of very ordinary experience things. And so they omit not only the wine case, but, and this brings me to my third point, the perfume case, which is, as you know, I tried to make a very similar point that you made, and in fact it seems to me you may want to add perfume to your arsenal because it's an even stronger instance of something that is clearly constructed with both a, if you want, I called it a vertical, but you can say spatial structure as well as a temporal one. And I didn't bring out in my talk, but for all of the analogies between perfume and wine, which are numerous, the one difference is the formula. That is, the perfumer in constructing something is not, the winemaker is in a sense constrained a bit by nature. He can mix, he can do all kinds of things, but finally nature does its bit. There's a sense in which the perfumer is much freer. And these are much more clearly structured things. Anyway,
no, thanks. Well, so just very quickly, that is a really interesting difference between wine and perfumes, and the role of intention in the making and appreciation of wine is a really complicated issue that I've discussed elsewhere, but not here. I should discuss, so two things. I should maybe say more about perfumes, but I just don't know anything about them, so I need to read your work and Jim's work and other people's work. And just the final thing I would just say is that, I'm sorry in a way. I mean, another apology about this talk in the sense that you always wonder with this whether you're just stating the bleeding obvious to the already converted. And I take it there is a bit of that, because I don't know how many people agree with the kind of olfactory observations of the philosophers I've been criticizing, but they're in a way they're the standard views, because very few people work on olfaction, and traditionally when they've done so, it's to really downplay its representational capacities. So they're worth attacking, but maybe they're not that worth attacking. I mean, I don't know. So I'm sorry if it was just too, attacking the converted. I mean, preaching to the converted.